Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Rotarians. It is my proud privilege to introduce Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, our speaker for this afternoon. Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia is a distinguished fellow, Foreign Policy Studies Program at the Gateway House. He is a member of CII's two bodies, International Trade Policy Council and Africa Committee. He served as chair of FICCI's core group of experts on BIMSTEC. He continues to head its task force on the blue economy. He is a founding member of the Kalinga International Foundation. As Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs from 2012 to 15, he played a key role in strengthening India's track to research and outreach activities. During a 37-long, fantastic innings, I would say, in the Indian Foreign Service, he served as ambassador to Myanmar, to Mexico, and as High Commissioner to South Africa and to Kenya. He dealt with part of South Asia while he was posted as Joint Secretary at Ministry of External Affairs. He's a prolific columnist, I would call him a scholar, who has also written a critically acclaimed book called India-Myanmar Relations, Changing Contours. He's a frequent speaker on foreign policy issues in India and abroad. He was Senior Visiting Research Fellow during 2011-13 at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. He holds a master's degree in political science from the University of Allahabad. Mr. Bhatia, we are deeply grateful to you for accepting to speak to us at short notice, and also want to thank my fellow Rotarian Manjeet to connect us with you, and looking forward to your talk this afternoon. Over to you, Ambassador Bhatia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar. Greetings to all of you from the National Capital, President Mehta, Mr. Jamal, Secretary, Mr. Kumar, all the members who are present here today. I must say how delighted I am to have been given this chance to address the second oldest Rotary Club of India, comprising such eminent people from the business capital of this country. I cannot thank Manjeet Kripalani, Executive Director, Gateway House, enough for inviting me and putting me in touch with this great institution. I say this not out of formality. I sincerely believe that Rotarians around the world have been doing a formidable job. I know a little bit about it because when actually I was serving as ambassador in countries outside India, I did have occasions once in a while, to address the Rotarians in places like Toronto, Pretoria, Nairobi, and I always found that this gave to me as an Indian diplomat a great outreach to establish friendships with the elites in those countries. So in that background, to address the elite of our own country through this channel is a really very special privilege. I'm on the horn of a bit of a dilemma, whether to speak as a diplomat, which I'm no longer one, or to speak as a student of the international relations, which I am. You know all how diplomats are. There is the popular perception of a man who is educated, sophisticated, who normally drives in a long stretched black Mercedes flying the flag, and who always would remember a woman's birthday, but would never remember her age. But at the same time, we also know that Sir Winston Churchill, I think it was he, the Prime Minister of Britain then, who had once said that diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell in such a nice way that they are tempted to ask for the directions. So maybe I need not speak as a diplomat, I could perhaps be a little bit more candid and frank in assessing the foreign policy scenario, because I'm sure all of you would like to know a little bit more than the story that is conveyed through the media headlines. So maybe I will do the tightrope walk and speak as a former diplomat, but very much as a keen student of the Indian foreign policy. Now, thank you very much for giving me the chance to have roughly about 30 minutes, which is the Rotary tradition, I think. And then we could have, hopefully, would have triggered some questions, questions, not too difficult ones, the ones which I can answer. But let me say that I don't want to go all over, and therefore I have a kind of a broad framework in my mind. I don't have a written script, but I will try to adhere to that framework. Let me first touch a little bit on the broad geopolitical picture of the world today, because the theme that I've chosen is India's foreign policy in a changing world. So the changing world part has to be brought in first. Then from there, I will go and speak about the foreign policy first in a broad way, in a general way, and then I'll take you on a journey through various geographies or regions of the world as to how India's relations are with those regions. And then we will end up probably looking at some of the critical themes that the country's leadership faces today. And undoubtedly, we will need to touch on China and Pakistan in that context. Now, it is really my privilege to mention, I'm going to mention two books on this occasion, not for any commercial purposes, but simply because they have been found to be very interesting and useful by me. And I know that some of you, all cerebral people, but some of you very keen people might wish to go and do some further reading when you get time, that is. I'm starting with Richard Haas, a very respected name, in the American strategic community. He wrote a book called A World in Disarray. This came out in 2017. And Mr. Haas basically said that the way the past 20 years or so have gone about, it has showed that the 21st century is going to be very different from the previous 4 centuries, which constitute the modern period. He refers to Mark Twain's saying that history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Similar incidents, similar developments, similar trends take place. But Richard Haas says that in the coming decades of the 21st century, history may not even rhyme, because things would be very, very different. Now, this theory is indeed proving somewhat correct, because we know in the past 2 decades, which opened on the blowing up of the Twin Towers, and then it was followed by those big wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Then you had the 2008-9 global financial and economic crisis. And thereafter, in the past decade, past 7-8 years, you saw tremendous intensification of the US-China strategic contestation, especially with the arrival of President Xi Jinping to power. All this was happening before COVID arrived. COVID, which, as you know, opened its innings, so to say, towards November or December 2019 in Wuhan, has completely dominated the psyche of the world today. I was looking at the figures, and it came to my mind that if last September somebody had written that an illness would visit this world, which will strike over 30 million people, and it would kill nearly 1 million people before the year is out, that person would have been certified as a nut. But all this has actually happened, as you know. And it is really anybody's guess as to what the score would be next September or next October, when we would complete another year from now. So the point that I'm making is that the world is indeed changing in a rapid manner, in a manner that was not expected. And this is best reflected by the new words which have now come into our terminology. We knew that when it came to work, we went to office. Now we hear about WFH, work from home. We knew our children went to school to study. Now we hear of online education or e-classes. We knew if you wanted to be introducing somebody, you met and shook hands. And now we are e-introducing people. So all these words, all these new modes, and above all, of course, we knew from class 1 when we went to school that a human being is a social animal. We now hear of a new concept named social distancing. So our lives, our work, our way of thinking, our way to self-protect, our way to connect with the lot. And this is the best example. Here sitting in a suburb of Delhi, Noida, I am talking to all of you, and in the process denying probably a lovely lunch, which normally the Rotarians would have offered. But this is the new normal. This is the new life. The world is not just changing, the world has changed. And therefore, we have to really see how we are going to deal with it. Now, in that context, I think very quickly, as a student of foreign affairs, I can say that first of all, in the last 2 decades, it's very clear, power has shifted from the West to the East. No longer America and Europe are as active and as powerful and as influential as Asia is. And within Asia, while of course much talk is made of China, there are other players, and certainly India is one of them. And therefore, this power shift that has been happening is of great significance to all of us, and especially all of you, the elite sitting in Mumbai. Secondly, I think while power is shifting, the ultimate outcome has not been decided yet. And therefore, this race between number 1, the present number 1, the US, and the rising number 2, that is China, has intensified. US regards China as its strategic adversary. Across the spectrum of issues, there are difficulties, there are tensions, and this trend, this fact, say most American scholars, is probably going to continue even if there is a change in the incumbency of the White House in a few weeks. Thirdly, of course, in this battle between number 1 and number 2, there are a whole set of other powers. There are major powers such as Europe, Russia, Japan. There are middle powers such as South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, and the rest of them, and small powers. They all are engaged in trying to protect and promote their own interests, keeping in mind that a big race, a big competition, a big contestation is already going on. And it is in this context, I think, 2 more trends or factors we must note. One, undoubtedly, is the fact that already before COVID, economy of many countries were slowing down. India certainly was one of them. After COVID, economic stress has increased significantly. And the way figures are coming about of even the Western economies, planning to contract by 10 or 15% at the end of the current financial year, it is easy to imagine what would be the impact on the developing world's economies, including India. You would know all of this much better than I do. But all that I can say is that this is very much the question of great stress and great concern to all of us. And finally, I think beyond economy, we should also mention that technology is having a huge impact on the change that is occurring. All of you know this very well. Many of us would not be able to say very much about the so-called IR4 technologies. We have been hearing a lot about the Internet of Things and about digital manufacturing and the rest of it. But the point that we know very well is that, frankly, until the COVID era made its appearance, many of these things, including the platform on which we are talking today, were really known only to a small band of people. Now, this has really entered our lives, technology, in a big way. So in this slide, in this broad framework, let us have a look at the scene as far as the Indian foreign policy is concerned. Let us come in from the broader view into the more specific sections. I think the broader view would indicate to us that in the past 75 years, Indian foreign policy has evolved through various phases. But one constant is there, which is that there is a good blend of certain unchanged features and also of the new features or new trends. This is the story from Jawaharlal Nehru to Narendra Modi. Almost every prime minister has taken keen interest in the formulation and conduct of the foreign policy and in presenting himself as the head of diplomacy of this country. Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, then in the modern era, Narasimha Rao, undoubtedly Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, and now, of course, Narendra Modi. It's also an interesting fact that three of the foreign ministers of this country, Vajpayee, Narasimha Rao, and Gujral, they became the prime ministers. And while on that, a small snippet also we should mention that two of the secretaries in the Ministry of External Affairs, Natwar Singh and then later Jaishankar, also rose to become the foreign ministers. So in a way, we can say that foreign policy does represent a major part of the statecraft of India. And when we say South Block, the building in Delhi that houses, as you know, the Prime Minister's office, the office of the Ministry of External Affairs, the office of the Ministry of Defense Affairs, and just across the road, Finance Ministry and Home Ministry, South Block represents the nerve center, in a way, of the highest echelon of India's governance. So what happens in South Block? What drives South Block? The kind of heritage it has, because some of us who had the privilege to serve in those historic rooms, where VIPs come, dignitaries interact, agreements are signed, and historic events have taken place, we feel that it's very important to let the people of India know more and more about the foreign policy making and the mysteries of diplomacy, so to say. So in that context, I would like to say in a very sober and objective manner that we can focus our attention now, given the constraint of time, on foreign policy of the past decade. In that fashion, you have a chance to look at the previous government and the present government, and therefore then the comparison becomes a little bit more balanced. Again, I have no intention to go much deep into that, except to say that we did have earlier a prime minister who was very well regarded. In fact, I remember when Dr. Manmohan Singh took over as the prime minister, back in 2004, I was serving as ambassador in Myanmar. And, there was a great deal of excitement and enthusiasm that India had a prime minister who held a PhD. So he was very well regarded. And, especially the first term and the successes, we all know, we don't have to go too much into it. So in that context, if now we look at the period from 2014 to 2020, I think we have to recognize objectively as a keen observer of foreign policy scene that the present Prime Minister has invested very heavily in terms of energy, time, effort, endeavor, resources in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy. I think there is a little doubt that he is inspired by the vision that India has a global destiny, that India is an emerging power, that India is a power with global view and global interests. And I think all of us as Indians have taken much pride in the fact that he has traveled around the world, made new friendships, strengthened the old friendships. And it's clear that India's image and position have strengthened in the process diplomatically. At the same time, I think there are some people who feel that obviously the Modi legacy, the assessment of this, the present is not the right time. The right time will come in future when this chapter would have ended. Nevertheless, since very important things are happening, a debate is already underway, and it is really up to you, depending on what your prism is, what your bias or ideology is, to sit down and make an assessment. Maybe we can touch this a bit more in the question hour session. Now, in this slide, I would like now to take you quickly through 4 or 5 major regions and assess as to how India's relations are with those regions. Now, first is not really a region, it is a group of what I call major powers. Very often scholars begin a discussion of Indian foreign policy by talking about India and the neighbors, but I'm making a change. I feel that if India is an emerging power, India should start by looking at how the relationship is with the major powers. And undoubtedly, we have to start with the US. I think everybody agrees that in the past 2 decades, India-US relationship has improved significantly. We see this in terms of the exchange of visits, the agreements signed, but I think especially in 2 or 3 fields, in the defense field and the economic field, and of course the political domain, it is clearly understood that for US, India is an important partner. And of course, for India, the importance of US has, if anything, increased in the recent years. Yet, on the other hand, you do have a leadership at present in the US where the approach to foreign relations is by nature what is called transactional. It is not that they often refer to the common values, democracy, freedom, the rest of it. It is more transactional, it is more pragmatic. And undoubtedly, when we talk about India-US relations, we have to perforce refer to the impact of China, because with China emerging as a major issue of concern both to the US and to India, India-US relationship probably has become even closer. And yet, I think we must take note of the fact that particularly some American scholars argue that it is not that America is chasing India to become a strategic partner or an alliance partner or a kind of a NATO partner, and that India is trying to safeguard its strategic autonomy or independence. It is that Washington has to continue reading China in a correct manner. And if there is convergence between that reading and New Delhi's reading, then this strategic partnership between the two capitals would remain strong and vibrant. And I'll come when I reach East Asia to explain how this actually is happening. Beyond US, I think Europe is also important. By Europe, I mean more specifically France, Germany, UK, and European Union. These four are important pillars of what we call Europe today. And France in the defense and technology field, Germany in the economy, investment, trade field, UK given the old historical connections, and EU, which is emerging, European Union emerging as the true representative of Europe. These four pillars, India has tried to cultivate, but not fully successfully. There were complications also because, as you know, in the Trump era, US-Europe relations also came under stress for a variety of reasons. So essentially, the COVID era has brought a new dynamics, and I think both in Brussels, the seat of European Union, and Delhi, there is a fresh, reinvigorated effort to try to strengthen this relationship, to look at some of the economic partnership agreements which have been pending for many years, and also to create that strategic domain which particularly the Germans and the French and the UK are very keen on. So I can say India-Europe relationship is, as judged by the recent summit between Prime Minister Modi and the European leaders, is heading in a positive territory. Third, of course, Russia. We have to remember Russia is a good, solid, traditional partner. It is not the same class as India had in the Soviet Union. That was a different era. There is also no doubt that today Russia-China relationship is quite close. But nevertheless, I would submit, I would argue that India and Russia are very important to each other. And I think Delhi's attempt is very much to keep each other in good company. And then there is Japan. I would try to quickly cover Japan in the East Asian situation. So in a way, major powers is a significant portfolio, and we are doing a lot of work there. The second region which I should or the domain I should take you is undoubtedly the neighbors. Here I can afford to be brief because you all know you're dealing with our neighbors in one form or the other, whether you are a businessman or you are a lawyer or you are doing something involving South Asia, you are dealing with them. We do have countries with which we have good, more positive, closer relationships, such as Bangladesh, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and we have others, Pakistan, Nepal, with whom we have strained relationship. And then we have Myanmar, which is important and is handled delicately. But I think what is common to all of this is undoubtedly the China factor. The involvement of this external power in our region has complicated the life for the foreign policy makers and diplomats. They know what the challenges are. There is the challenge of China's attempt to keep India bogged down in South Asia. And of course, there is the shadow and the weight of a very thick checkbook that Chinese possess. And yet, I think India too have its own assets. And India, I think, as far as I can see, is determined and resolute to continue to play a cooperative leader's role in South Asia. Then moving quickly to the external or to the extended neighborhood, we have all these regions, West Asia, Central Asia, Indian Ocean, and the Indo-Pacific region, which is East Asia, but also includes Indian Ocean. In all these regions, Indian diplomacy is very active. Time would not allow me to go into detail, except to say 2 sentences about Indo-Pacific. This is a new concept. The concept is that East Asia, where the Pacific Ocean washes its shores, and the Indian Ocean are strategically linked. So what happens there impacts on developments here, and what happens here impacts on developments there. This is the logical reason of the rise of China and the contestation that now US, India, Japan, and Australia have decided to offer. And this is where in the Indo-Pacific, a new partnership is emerging named the Quad, the quadrilateral diplomatic partnership involving these 4 countries, US, India, Australia, and Japan. And scholars are very excited about what all this partnership would be able to do in terms of contesting the less than friendly behavior of China. So in that light, I think we also should say at least a sentence or two about 2 other regions. One is Africa. This is very dear to my heart. It is a subject of my specialization. It is very clear that a lot of people in India are not fully aware and conscious of the rising importance of Africa. It is a continent of 54 countries on way to economic development, democracy, and integration. And it would have such a big population by 2050 that is likely to play a bigger role in the world. And therefore, this explains why the Modi government has been taking a great deal of interest in Africa. And of course, at the end, Latin America too is important for a country like India, which has, as I said, global view. And incidentally, some of you who are the economic entrepreneurs, they have been doing very well in terms of promoting the trade and investment linkages with Latin America. So in this light, towards the end now, let me just highlight 2 or 3 more points. First point is that India stands for what we call multilateralism. That is, to resolve the world's problems through not between 2 countries, but through larger groupings, whether it is the United Nations or WHO or the rest of them. All these international or multilateral institutions have become, most of them have become weaker than they used to be. And therefore, India is committed to strengthen multilateralism. And India's argument is that the only way to do this is to make sure that the multilateral institutions reflect the power reality of today. We all know that UN Security Council, the 5 permanent members, they are the victors of the Second World War, which took place 75 years back. And the reason why a country such as India is not part of that, which has all the credentials to be part, this has to change. This has been the India's consistent position. Whether it would succeed, that is a separate story. And moving from multilateralism to multipolarity, I think this is a very significant concept. The point here is, and this is where we can bring China in, people keep asking as to what is the difficulty, why are these things are happening in Ladakh? From early May to now, talks and yet, no resolution yet. We are waiting for the results of the last meeting, which continued until this morning. Scholars have different views, but my own humble view is that there are local regions, there are regional regions, but the biggest reason is that there is a clash of visions between Beijing and Delhi. China, on way to be number 1 in the world, wants to be immediately number 1 in Asia. That is their vision. But India's vision, India's goal is to have a multipolar Asia. In fact, India argues that a multipolar demands a multipolar Asia. A multipolar Asia, it would be where all countries receive equality and respect and ability to pursue their interests. We do not see Asia in a hierarchical situation, which the Chinese do. And this is where the problem is, this is where the difficulty is, that even after 20 or so meetings and conversations between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, we could not reach a common vision. We began very well. Before Xi Jinping arrived on the scene, there was a talk, as you remember, at the beginning of the 21st century, of 21st century being the Asian century. Both Dr. Manmohan Singh and Prime Minister Modi fully subscribed to it. But President Xi Jinping came and he started talking about China's dream. Now, if that China dream becomes a nightmare for others, and it is at the expense of the Asian century, then I'm afraid there would be a lot of pushback, which actually we have been seeing in the COVID months, in the past 6 months. So in this light, I think we have to recognize that this India-China contestation probably will continue into the future. A quick word on our favorite country, Pakistan, because I don't want to be, told that, you didn't even utter a word about Pakistan. I think there is a problem there. There is again a fundamental divergence. Pakistan has not given up its obsession about Kashmir. And India is absolutely resolute that it cannot talk and discuss with a country which follows and pursues terrorism as a state policy. I think our present leaders are very convinced, and I think they are convinced aptly, that I cannot befriend you if you are all the time out to hurt me and damage my interests. So while as a diplomat, I would say, create communication channels, I can understand at the same time a totally new and unique situation where Pakistani attempt to run talks along with terrorism is simply not acceptable to India. So in this light, dear friends, as I conclude, I would say India has a complex foreign policy to run. India depends on the ingenuity of its diplomats, but more importantly, everything depends on India's military strength, India's economic capabilities, India's technological success, and at the national support and the moral support and the engagement and commitment of our people with this entire foreign policy canvas, which I've tried to touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. That was truly insightful. And I'm sure we have many questions from our members. Mudit, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you, High Commissioner and Ambassador Mr. Bhatia. My question is, would foreign policy should take a backseat as many economies of countries are destroyed and they would be focusing inwards as opposed to globalization, which was the norm before this pandemic? Thank you.
Could you please repeat your first sentence again, Mr. Jain?
Yes, sir. My question was, would foreign policy be in decline by countries as they would be focusing more on their internal issues because their economies are destroyed? Whereas before this pandemic, globalization was the trend, and now it would be more kind of internal damage control. Thank you.
Well, I think, naturally the answer will probably depend on country to country. In the circles that I move, there is a very deep dive discussion on the nature and future of globalization. Globalization seemed to be the set trend for everyone until protectionism emerged as a force, and some of these nationalistic leaders started to switch themselves away from the global trend, Trump and then Brexit and then Turkey and the rest of it. But at the same time, in my assessment, globalization is here to stay. maybe more in the domain of technology and the domain of communication and in the domain of look at what's happened in the health sector. One tiny little virus in Wuhan has, globalized this illness, which has reached over 200 countries. So I would say that certainly it will not turn a country like India into an inward-looking country. India is set on certainly the path of Atmanirbharta or self-reliance, but it would be Atmanirbharta with an external face, with an international connection. So as a scholar on foreign policy, I do not see at all a country like India turning inwards.
Thank you. Jagdish Malkani, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Ambassador. That was very insightful. I need to put you on the mat a little bit about China, where I think the regime, putting it diplomatically, was economical with the truth, at least upfront, on the huge skirmish on the border with the Prime Minister himself telling us not a blade of grass is gone, etc. Now, if you agree with that, isn't it rather short-sighted? I mean, this is an era of transparency, GPS, satellites, etc. Who are we kidding if that is true? And what does that speak about the ability of the regime?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm quite used to being in that spot. In fact, the other day I was on Chinese television, and when I was berating the Chinese government, the anchor said, "But your Prime Minister has said this." This is, something that we have to see in the larger context. I think only those who are engaged in statecraft can understand the burdens and complexities of running the office, as high an office as the Prime Minister of India. I think we have to judge this government by what it is saying in the parliament. I think one of the finest statements made on the subject was by Raksha Mantri just the other day in the Lok Sabha. We have analyzed it and we have found that he has put across very well the entire picture, and at the same time, I think I would also draw your kind attention to a kind of a nutshell agreement that Foreign Minister Jaishankar and his Chinese counterpart reached in Moscow just the other day. I think if we read these two documents carefully, we would recognize that India's position is logical, it is sound, and it is very calibrated, it is very sober. I think it's very important to recognize our own situation. We must recognize that we are in a vulnerable situation, and therefore it's very important how to handle the situation, the prospect, the challenge that are there with us. Mr. Rajnath Singh said very clearly, as I heard him live on when he was speaking to the Lok Sabha, he fully narrated and analyzed the China's doings, and yet he said that two things are important. One, India wants to solve things through the peaceful methods, but India is prepared to face any other eventuality. So I request you and all my other colleagues as well to see the India-China face-off or even the conflict today in a nationalistic frame, rising above the narrow political considerations.
Thank you. Can we have Manjeet ask your question, please? Manjeet? Shani, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, can I?
Go ahead, Manjeet. Go ahead, please.
Just very quickly, a follow-up, one question and related to that. So on China, the talks yesterday, Ambassador Bhatia, took 13 hours. Is that a good sign or a bad sign? There's been quite a lot of reaction with that. And secondly, on Africa, China and Africa, how can India even compete with China's checkbook in Africa?
Thank you very much, Manjeet. Both excellent questions. 13 hours must be including a lot of translations, interpretations, consulting the headquarters in Beijing and Delhi. Surely there would also be differences which have to be resolved. And I guess it must have also included some lunches and dinners as well. I would, as a diplomat say, as a former diplomat say, that it is always better to talk rather than let the arms do the talking. This is the time, as Prime Minister rightly said, this is the age not of expansionism and aggression, but of peace and development. If this is accepted, then I would say 13, you talk for 26 hours as long as you get moving and do not take talks just for, doing other things, which sometimes Chinese do. About China and Africa, having spent there 7 years and having studied Africa in some depth, I do recognize your worry that when your rival has a lot more money than you have, then how do you stay in the game? I'm not despondent at all, because China's checkbook diplomacy is getting exposed in various parts of Africa. You know, they go around making these stadia and palaces, and in the process pass on probably a lot of resources to the local leaders, but the game is being seen through. On the other hand, if India listens to African voices, and I think we are listening to their voices, then what they're saying is that come and help us, train us, create employment, put investment, and grow with us. You know, for example, I mean, you know, they said, why manufacture in India for the world? Why not manufacture in India and Africa for the world? So it is that kind of collaborative thing Africa is looking for. And I would say, I would not claim that India is #1 in Africa today, it is not. But India is very much in the game. And I think India hopefully will win the long game.
Thank you.
Shirley, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, once again, this is about China and the fact that not only they have these expansionistic tendencies, not only to control through investments, but also by controlling water. We understand that they have put almost 83 dams all across their river, the main river, which comes into many countries around them, and 18 countries around them. And how is this going to impact? You know, they have an agenda which is beyond diplomacy.
Yes, Madam Vakil, you are right about this. There is every reason to be concerned about this matter. And I think there are the experts in the government machinery which have been looking at it, you know, not merely the short term, but also the long term implications. But I think policy cannot be run on the worst case scenarios. I think policy has to take into account the worst case scenarios, but also it has to be somewhat realistic and somewhat optimistic. I want to refer the second book, again, not for commercial reasons, but for the reason that it is a very useful book. I don't know whether my camera is catching it. This is Jaishankar's new book, The India Way. And I'm referring to this because here the serving foreign minister quotes a former foreign secretary whom he hails as the top sinologist. And that man, Shyam Saran, said that deception is part of the Chinese way to behave, to operate. So I think we should be very clear. I quite see when Indians tell each other, don't trust China. Nobody is trusting China. It's not a question of trusting China. It's a question of doing business with China. in fact, one of my friends said that if China were a country located next to Brazil, we would have no problems. Our problems arise because this guy is sitting on our border. And therefore, I would say that certainly be on your guard, but you have to do business with him. So when Raksha Mantri says we are ready for peace, or when Jaishankar says, you know, we have signed this agreement, let us trust our own people. Nobody is asking you to trust China.
Rohan Dalal, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador, for an engaging talk. My question is in the same vein. You talked about the Quad group, you know, and it has remained sort of informal as an engagement, you know, with these four countries. What prevents them, you know, these four countries from sort of coming together more formally? We heard that Australia was prevented to participate in naval exercises in the Indian Ocean. And, you know, at the same time, there is this sort of Chinese belligerence, and because of its economic and military strength, you know, it would do, it would benefit India to be part of such an alliance, you know, more formally. So can you weigh in on that, please?
Thank you very much for asking this question. I think my colleagues and I at the Gateway House, which is your own, Bombay's own institution, we have been among a handful of experts in this country who have been studying the Quad for the past 3 or 4 years very closely. Back in, I think, 2018, we came to the conclusion that the Quad's cohesion and strength would grow in proportion to China's aggressive behavior. So this certainly has proved correct. As China has become more and more aggressive, the unity of the Quad and effectiveness of the Quad is increasing. Today, of course, you know that there is a kind of a political transition in 2 of the 4 member countries. US, where elections are about to take place. Japan, where the new prime minister is just about taking over. But I think we are still very much adhering to the view that the way Chinese are going about it, you know, creating problems all across their periphery, from Japan to Taiwan to Hong Kong to South China Sea to ASEAN and India and beyond, the Quad will have a bright future. And I just want to make one very fundamental point. Because China represents not just a political or diplomatic or strategic threat, it also represents a major economic challenge. The Quad will have to develop all its dimensions, including the economic dimensions. We at Gateway House, under Manjeet Kriplani's leadership, are engaged precisely in that. And I think here, some of my very eminent listeners can actually help us, because it's important for these 4 countries and their partners. And there are quite a few other partners, so let's not think that we are just 4 of us. There are a lot more partners who are also engaged in pushback against China. Let us develop a strong economic pillar or dimension to face the China challenge.
Thank you.
SV, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, thank you, Fali. Ambassador, excellent talk and very candid answers. As you rightly said, you know, history will judge this government or what this government's foreign policies and other things are. My question is, in terms of Tibet, you know, the way Tibet was handed over to China on a platter almost during the Nehru years, you think, and without realizing the geostrategic implications on a long-term basis, Tibet is in a higher territory, controlling rivers, etc. Brahmaputra's source there is Sangpo. So what are your views on that? And a related, or not a related question, another question is, during the previous regime, the Sharm el-Sheikh fiasco that happened when a statement was given purportedly, a joint statement of India and Pakistan, where there were references to Balochistan. It would be very interesting to know your views on both these, please. Thank you very much.
Well, clearly you are a man who loves history. I would prefer to talk about what will happen in 2030 rather than what happened 5 years or 50 years back. But I cannot, of course, take. Yeah, I have to answer both your questions. I'll do it briefly on Tibet. I would like to correct the impression that it was handed over by India. The fact actually is that it was taken over by the PLA physically. And then it was all a question of trying to work out a situation that would be palatable or acceptable. Now, I would not really go into the merits and demerits of the decisions then. All that I know as a student of history, that when we take a rear view on past decisions, you can reach any conclusions. You're free to do that. But when you have the burden of power and the burden of office on you, and you have all your cards in front of you, then you take certain kinds of decisions. So let history be the judge as far as Tibet is concerned. Sharmal al-Sheikh, I think, was, more a slip up. It was very recent. We all remember that. And I think the Manmohan Singh government received quite a lot of heat on that account. And I think linking it to the present today, I think Modi government's tough and resolute policy on Pakistan is something which has national support.
We have a question from Satyan now.
Yeah, thank you, Fali. Ambassador Bhatia, really engaging, very insightful. I just wanted to shift focus from China for a moment and take it to Russia and Pakistan, their relationship, because India has been cozying up with USA in the last few years. How does it play out between Russia and Pakistan? Because they are trying to cozy up with Russia.
Russians are very good diplomats, and Russians also are strategic thinkers. They have a long civilization and so on as well, like us, and a pretty strong, good diplomatic tradition. So while Russia and India tell each other that your third country friendships do not concern us or bother us, the fact is actually they do. And therefore, just as we have moved closer to the US, they have already moved closer to China. And now it's a question of more leg room. So knowing Pakistan's crucial position in South Asia, naturally Moscow likes to keep its channels open. There is the Afghanistan angle as well. And of course, the China-Pakistan axis also builds into that. But please remember that it was Russia which insisted from the beginning that India must be part of the Central Asian strategic framework. So India came into SCO because of Russia. Please also remember that the bulk of defense imports are still India doing from Russia. And also finally remember that the Modi government has invested very heavily in developing a very close strategic partnership and understanding with Moscow. And I think this is the right thing to do. You have to do everything possible to make sure that the Russia-China relationship does not become any stronger. So they are very much in the game. And I think my judgment is that India is on a good wicket with Moscow today.
Thank you.
We have gone over our time limit, but if Ambassador Bhatia is willing to take 2 more questions, I think we have them ready for you.
I'm at your disposal, sir.
Thank you so much. SV, would you like to ask your question?
SK.
Sorry, SK? Well, in the meantime, okay, Farhat, would you please? There you are, SK. Come on.
I'm going. I've unmuted myself. May I ask?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Mr. Bhatia, thank you for telling us that the current regime is on the right track. But we have a lot of doubt seeing the media headlines. my question is that while we have a lot of intrigues from our small nations, big ones from Pakistan and China, China itself has a lot of problems with its neighbors because of expansionist behavior. Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, and
I have a problem of listening, getting you through. Can you speak into your microphone, please?
I think we've lost SK. Farad, could you ask your question while he reconnects?
Yeah. Ambassador Bhatia, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. My question is, with the current dispensation in Sri Lanka with Rajapaksa back again in the seat, do you think the Chinese influences in Sri Lanka is back? And what is going to happen with Hambantota? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Hambantota and the port and the way they're going to manage it. So there's a huge concern in the diplomatic sectors and foreign policy issues about Sri Lanka's. Is Chinese influence waning, or is it going to come back again?
Yes, I think, it is normally said that diplomacy does not run on binaries. Diplomats do not have to choose between white and black, and they have to sometimes play through the grays. It is one of those situations here. Undoubtedly, Sri Lanka's present leadership is very well inclined towards China. But at the same time, they are fully aware of the fact that, India, this big, huge, massive, formidable neighbor is just right next door. And so what they are doing is they are sending two clear messages. Colombo says that in security terms, we will ensure that we don't pose any security threat to India, that India is our neighbor number one in security and diplomatic terms. But what they leave unsaid is important, which is that on the economic side, they will go wherever they get the resources, and that obviously is largely going to be China. They are willing to take assistance from India, but frankly, India's capacities are limited. So in short, Colombo is going to do a tightrope balancing act which suits India. I think, therefore, you would see from Delhi always very positive, constructive noises towards Colombo. And it will be a three or a triangular diplomatic dance that you will see. As far as Hambantota is concerned, the Sri Lankan government has been putting the blame on the previous government, saying they messed it up, they should not have done this, that, and the other, that, the security facilities are all with us, and they even want negotiations or renegotiations with China. What would be the result? We don't know. But we are clear that we want to play ball with Sri Lanka, and that is why we want to involve them fully. By we, I mean the government, bilaterally, but also regionally. So you will see a lot of India-Sri Lanka friendship coming up as the regional grouping, BIMSTEC, holds its summit in January. So I'm optimistic. We need not give up on them.
Thank you, Ambassador.
SK, have you joined again?
Yeah, I've joined, but
Please.
again,
Go ahead.
one second. What did I do now? Oh no.
Shall we take another one before you join in?
Oh shoot.
All right, can we have Pratap asking his question, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Ambassador Bhatia, thank you very much for that insightful talk. Given the current times, I feel my view is that a country needs to be economically strong in order to maintain the kind of trade relations that we are been negotiating. And I think it's all being reset now with the pandemic. And I think that's where somewhere center doesn't look to be, focusing strongly, because if you lose your economic sovereignty as an economic superpower, which we are all now beginning to believe that we are, then the whole trade balance and negotiating power, etc., will all wither away. Another question to this was, I wanted to know your view on this Pakistan occupied Kashmir. I mean, what is the status there? The current government has said that that belongs to us, and there was some movement about us talking about regaining that, that space. Where is the, on international basis, where does this position stand? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I can only answer you briefly on the economic issue. It comes to the economic agreements and the rest of it, and linking this with the economic prospects for India. I think now, India is not all that fascinated by these free trade agreements. I think there is a certain reservation, and I sense that reservation emanates from big business cities like Mumbai and Chennai and certainly Delhi as well. And the government is listening to your voices, so to say, and that's why you noticed that when it came to the negotiations for RCEP, the big comprehensive agreement in East Asia, we stepped back. So there is a certain degree of fatigue with FTAs, but there is a focus on obviously revving up the economic engine of India. It will take time, but I think in the policy makers, there is a confidence that if not immediately this year, in the next 2 or 3 years, we would be back once we have taken control over COVID. So I think on that, again, one can be optimistic rather than pessimistic. As far as the POK is concerned, this is a very complex issue, as you know. Indeed, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, very phrase shows that it doesn't belong to them. It certainly doesn't belong to any other country. It belongs to India. But that is one aspect. The question or the feasibility of getting it back through peaceful means, through negotiations, through dialogue, how good are those chances? I think you and I and all of us know the answer. I think 75 years have gone. Let us hope that there will be some miracles.
So may I now, President, sir?
Yes, go ahead, please. Okay. This will be the last question.
Yeah, last question, a very brief one. Thank you, Diplomat Bhatia. You really give us some positive vibes here. We see so many misleading headlines. It looks like the present government is on the correct, right track. My question is that while India has a lot of pinpricks with its small neighbors, China also has a lot of problems with its neighbors, particularly because of its expansionism. It has got problems with Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, and all of that. So how India is taking advantage of that? India is pretty close to Japan now, but is India doing the right things in that area?
Very good question, sir. I'm glad that you managed to overcome the technical issue there.
Old man problem, old man syndrome.
Yeah. No, but we are adapting. We are all new to this.
No,
I had the honor to
physical activity, so I was getting disturbed. Sorry, thank you.
Indeed, I had the honor to fly the Indian flag in 2 capitals in that region, Indonesia and Myanmar, and kept my interest alive. I think you are absolutely right. The pushback against China that I spoke is coming from a large number of their neighbors. I remember visiting Philippines just 2 years back, Indonesia, Malaysia. There's a lot of dissatisfaction, but at the same time, I think we have to objectively assess that none of them individually can do very much as far as China is concerned. And that is why they look to the bigger powers for leadership, for direction. And that is where the importance of the Quad comes into the picture. You may not have seen news, but just a few weeks back, the Defense Minister of Indonesia paid a quiet visit to Delhi. Quiet means it was really unannounced. And he had his interactions with the Indian authorities and he went back. And then soon thereafter, we heard that a new trilateral dialogue would start involving India, Australia, Indonesia. So as ASEAN as a group, they are very wary about their neutrality and so on. But countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, you already know, is very assertive because they've suffered a lot at the Chinese hands. And the Philippines, which is really kind of evenly divided. You have a president there who is very friendly to China, but the army leadership is not sharing the president's view. So we need to look at the, what we call granular scene to realize that India is driving its Act East policy. In fact, in my view, it needs to be updated. It is driving a policy whereby good relationship with all those countries which are uneasy or unhappy is very important. So if Chinese can play the game in South Asia, there is no reason why India cannot play similar and even a smarter game in Southeast Asia and East Asia.
Thank you. That's great comfort.
Ambassador Bhatia, we have one last question, please.
Sure.
Manoj, go ahead.
Thank you, President. Ambassador Bhatia, my question again comes back to the free trade agreement. As you know that in textiles, we've been really pushing the free trade agreement for Europe and UK, and especially now since UK is out of the Brexit, so we've been also been pushing our government, because what is happening is, sir, that we in the Far East, yes, India has exports, but you see the major consumer countries are Europe and USA. So it's very important to have FTA with Europe and Europe especially and UK. Another point is that even now Vietnam has also got a free trade agreement with Europe, and Pakistan also has a free trade agreement with Europe and UK, which is, they're having a 10% advantage over India. So, sir, what do you think we should do to see that the FTA, how we can push the FTA with, because that is really bringing the textile exports down for India?
Thank you very much for asking this very practical question, and this allows me to somewhat modulate my formulation which I presented to you earlier, and I do so with some inside information about the country's premier industry chamber, CII. I've been given access to hear some of the most prominent captains of business and industry talking about this issue. Recently, the view that is emerging from those councils is that India should not have FTAs with East Asia because they are really our competitors. Instead, India should have FTAs with Europe because they are our consumers, they are our markets. And in particular, textile sector has been mentioned. I think there is a lot of receptiveness to the idea that an FTA with EU would be wonderful, because then we can compete with countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh. So you have a good idea. I think you really need to write to the president of CII, ask him to lend support to this, and then the government will have to work a bit more, vigorously on this score.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all that. May I now request Honorary Secretary Satyan to propose a vote of thanks?
Sure. Ambassador Bhatia, thank you so much for this insightful discussion today. In fact, it's testimony that our question answer session ran beyond the talk that you gave. That shows a quality of insight which you presented. And for this afternoon that you have spent with us, as a token of appreciation, we'll be lighting up a rural household using solar power.
Oh, thank you very much.
We'll be sending the certificate in due course. And I have a few announcements, a few club announcements for the members. On Friday, 25th September at 2 p.m., we are having the virtual inauguration of the Airvo humidified respiratory facilities at the Tata Actrec and Masina hospitals. On Friday, the same day, 25th September at 6:30, we have the Russia Fellowship, where we do a virtual tour of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's a bring your own vodka event. On Saturday, 26th September at 5 p.m., there is a talk by a president nominee, Vineet Bhatnagar, on the subject MSME at Crossroads. And the Zoom links will be circulated in advance to all the members. Next week, at the weekly meeting. It's a Zoom meeting. We will have Mr. Rahul Bose, renowned actor, rugby player, philanthropist, and public speaker who will be addressing the club. Statistics for today, we had a maximum participation of 93. The meeting is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good pleasure, Bhatia.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice lunch, everybody.
Thanks.
You can unmute yourselves. I want to hear the stomach growling.
Thanks, Fali.
This was
Lovely
an
afternoon.
excellent meeting.
Perfect.
Perfect.
It really was. Thank you, Manjeet, and thank you, Farah.
Yeah, thanks to them. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Prashant, good to see you. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Satyan?
Yep.
Go ahead.